Now if we can just get Dennis to settle down. Okay, well, this morning we, I knew we wouldn't have our usual group, and the session that I was going to teach, continuing on in Daniel, was highly dependent on the last couple weeks, and then on from there, it would have put a hole in the middle of the series. So I decided to do something else. One of the things that I taught for many years at New Tribes was church history. And this particular episode we're going to look at this morning is one of my favorites because basically we could easily be a Baptist church without any problem because we do everything a Baptist church does. In the 50s, the Baptist churches kind of began to fade a little bit, and people started to call themselves Bible churches because the Baptists had some bad reputations in a few areas. And so that's why we're a Bible church. But we would certainly identify with the Baptists, as we're going to see in this morning's session. So we're going to talk about the Baptists and the Bill of Rights. And most people, historians, agree that the Bill of Rights would not necessarily be what it is, or certainly became in those days without the Baptists. Now, this whole story begins with Emperor Constantine in the 300s. In 313, he declared Christianity the favored religion. Up till then, Christianity had been persecuted. The pagans hated it and so forth. And any time Christians were meeting, they were in danger and so on. But he changed all of that. And he endowed it with privileges. He intertwined the church with government. And this sounds really good, but it was really bad because it started a tradition that has continued up until our own Bill of Rights. A few years after Constantine, Emperor Theodosius declares that Christianity is the official religion of the empire and no other religion can exist. And of course that, again, sounds really, really good, but it's not good because unfortunately it started a tradition of suppression of other ways of thinking. And this turned into a real negative because the pagans were suppressed, they became part of Christianity, etc., a whole long story. But from that point on, separation of church and state never existed at all until our Bill of Rights anywhere in the world, as far as the church was concerned. They had total control, but the problem would arise that there would be different kinds of churches. And whatever church was in charge then became the authoritarian church and suppressed all others. And that would continue until the 1700s. For instance, after the Protestant Reformation, Queen Elizabeth created an established church, which we call the Church of England or the Anglican Church. When it came here, it's often known as the Episcopal Church. And she disallowed all other forms of worship. You had to worship in the state church. This was continuing right from the time of Constantine through into England. She believed religious unity in a country or in a state would keep that country or kingdom or whatever a stable situation. So in the 1500s and the 1600s then in England, Christians, a certain group of them, as we're going to see, reacted against the state church. The state church was a rather cold sort of church. They read from printed material. Every Sunday they had to read certain portions. Sundays were assigned a certain verse and so on. And there were Christians who wanted to meet like we do and study the Bible together and fellowship together without a rigid sort of religion. Well, Puritans came along and they wanted to improve the Church of England, make it pure. That's where Puritan comes from. They wanted it to be biblical rather than based on a traditional way of worship. Then there were a second group called separatists. They wanted to leave the church altogether. The Puritans said, let's try and make it better. Let's work with it. Well, they were never allowed to. The separatists said, let's get out of here. Let's just not go to that church at all and have our own little churches, which sounds good. But it couldn't be done in those days. And so in the 1500s, a major separatist group was the Baptists. Now, there were other groups as well, because the Catholics were chased out at the same time during this period of Queen Mary and the subsequent leaders, King James I and on from there. The Catholics weren't allowed to worship. Presbyterianism had just begun to rise. It originated in Scotland with John Knox, and eventually it would become suppressed, and so on. But the Baptists were a major group that they went after. You see, because their position held two things. Immersion of believers, that's why we have this tub underneath my feet here where we've been baptized, and they eliminated infant baptism. Now that was really forbidden in those days because it had nothing to do with Christianity in general in the population. People believed through superstition that if they didn't have their baby baptized, that baby would get sick and die. So that even unbelievers, even those who would deny there's a God, had their babies baptized. Well, the Baptists said, we're not going to do that anymore. So there was a very strong government reaction to the Baptist movement. And initially it was Queen Elizabeth and the others that would do everything they could to get rid of it. There were laws and so forth. This one was by order of the king in Parliament, unlawful assembly, illegal to meet for religious worship without a license. Well, they weren't going to give the Baptists a license. Offenders will be fined, imprisoned, or banished altogether. And so the battle was underway. The punishment for Baptist offenders, severe fines, imprisonment. The jails were full of Baptists. Stocks, public shaming, banishing, loss of property, loss of jobs, and so on. It was considered a rebellion against the church and the crown. So that's how intertwined the church and government had become. The government would decree how people worship because they wanted to control the population. They felt that would bring stability. It didn't just happen to Baptists, it happened to other groups that were wanting to worship on their own, and it certainly happened to Catholics. Bloody Mary was always accused of killing so many Christians. Queen Mary killed just as many Catholics in her day. Queen Elizabeth, rather, killed many Catholics in her day because they didn't conform. After Queen Elizabeth came King James I of the King James Bible. The King James Bible exists because he didn't like the translations that were already there because some of them went against his beliefs. The King James Bible was not necessarily formed for pure biblical purposes. But he supported the Church of England, wouldn't allow religious liberty, and one of his statements was, I make them conform themselves, or I'll harry them out of the land, or else do worse. So it was a very unpleasant time. Many laws were passed, laws that are called conventicles. There were other types of laws that were written to suppress any kind of other religion. The Baptists are the ones that fought back. Baptist meetings were forbidden, jails were filled with them, and so many Christians, as we're all aware, left England because of intolerance of their faith. And the problem that arose immediately when those groups of Christians came to this country, they formed a church within a state and then would allow no other churches. They continued their intolerance of others in the colonies. For instance, the Mayflower, which we hear so much about, which came in 1620, there were 102 passengers. 1/3 of them were Puritans. They came to be known as Pilgrims. Other Puritans came as well. What did Puritans want to do? They wanted to improve the Church of England. They couldn't, so they formed their own congregations. They became known as Congregationalists. And they wanted to form a pure biblical society. They wanted to get together and worship around the Bible and study the Bible and so on. Their intentions were certainly good. But they did not believe in personal religious liberty either. And so freedom, as far as they were concerned, was only for themselves, not for competing religious beliefs. And throughout history, when an oppressed group became in charge, then they became the oppressors, almost consistently throughout history. It's just the way it happened. And so there were 3 states in particular. There were a lot of Congregationalists arriving in New England. So Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire established Congregationalism as their state church, and no other church could then exist. And so the suppression that England was carrying out, they brought with them to the states and suppressed others. The oppressed becoming the oppressor was very, very common throughout history. So Massachusetts was especially the center of this and established the Congregational Church. Now that was 1820. The first Baptist to leave England because he wanted to escape imprisonment was Roger Williams, and there's many books written on Roger Williams. He was quite an individual, very staunch and strong. He sailed for America, came in 1631, so 11 years after the Congregationalists. So by the time he arrived in New England, the Congregationalists were in control. And therefore, anything that Roger Williams tried to do and establish a church was forbidden. He was driven away, he was persecuted, he had to spend one entire winter, there's a long story about that, with the Indians with whom he had made friends because they had driven him out of the cities and so on. Well, in 1639, that's now 19 years after the Pilgrims arrived, he formed a Baptist church in Rhode Island. They brought, the Baptists bought some property and named the place Providence, which is now Providence, Rhode Island. And they were able to build a church there without persecution. That's the first Baptist church in the New World. So again, they carried with them this hated thing of infant baptism being eliminated and believer baptism being taught. Then the Second Baptist Church came to the colonies in 1614. And that was one of the beginnings of the desire for religious liberty. John Clark was a brilliant guy, wrote a great deal, and he developed some principles. We could list them all, but I only want to look at 2. That Christ is Lord of every area of life and head of the church. He did not like the government being the head of the church. And the second that he fought strongly for was religious liberty for all, being a God-given right. And of course, we hold that today. We take it for granted, but it's basically in this country where that's the case. Now, skipping the 3rd and 4th, the 5th Baptist Church in the U.S. was the First Baptist Church in Boston. And that was in 1665. We're now 45 years after the Mayflower, and the Congregational Church is in total control. And not because they're bad people, but that was the tradition. A state would have its own church. So they met secretly in private homes because it was illegal to worship outside of the state church in Massachusetts. Now, I like this particular illustration. Incidentally, these are all developed by AI. Now, these two guys standing in the window and this guy at the door, because as they met secretly in these homes, and they would come at different times and so on, so it didn't look like you were getting a big crowd or anything. And then you'd have the guards outside, sort of like we do, outside the front door nowadays. And if they saw somebody suspicious coming, if they saw someone coming who looked like they might be from the government or being officials, what they would do is send a warning inside. Everybody would clear out of the place. And so when the officials got there, well, there was nothing going on. And so this went on for a good period of time because they defied two laws that were written by the court in Boston. Anyone wishing to form a church must get permission from civil magistrates and the elders of other churches. In addition, the second was anybody opposing the baptism of infants will be subject to banishment. And so it was a very strong civil situation. For instance, one guy is just an example. Henry Dunster was the first president of Harvard, what was Harvard College at that time, refused to have his babies baptized. He was a Baptist. He was forced by the general court to resign his position from Harvard because of his refusal. So it was a very carefully controlled situation. Well, this group then continued in 1679. They built their first meeting house. They had started in 1665, so this is now 14 years later after they got going. And they didn't move for 150 years to a real church until they moved to a very prominent area in Boston even today. But it took 150 years. So, because of this movement of the Baptists, in 1700, there were only 24 Baptist churches in all the 13 colonies. They had 839 members. Now, how they know these numbers, I have no idea, but they knew. By 1790, there were 979 Baptist churches with 67,409 members. Or 90. The people enjoyed meeting like we do today to get together and study around the Bible. By 1800, they had become the largest denomination in America, so they had real influence. Because when you have a large number of people, you begin to have political influence. They need your votes. And so during that period of time, on July 4th, what we're celebrating this week, 1776, the Second Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. And they proclaimed that the 13 colonies would be free and independent states. But they didn't give their people liberty necessarily at this point. The Civil War was going on, I just got a mental block on fighting England. The Revolutionary War happens when you get older. Just ask us older people. But in September of '83 then was the end of the Revolutionary War. And the Treaty in Paris was signed by Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, John Kay, and then the representative from Great Britain. So that in the United States then in 1783 became an independent nation. So because they were now an independent nation, they needed a government. And so the first Constitutional Convention was held in Philadelphia 4 years after the signing of the peace treaty. And they met in 1786, and drafted the Constitution itself. And so then that Constitution had to be sent to the states in order to be ratified. And so when that ratification process, which starts our story that we're most interested in, when that ratification process got to Virginia, where Baptists were under tremendous pressure because Virginia had adopted the Church of England, the Anglican Church, as their official church. And of course, the Church of England didn't like anybody else. And so in June 1788 opened the Virginia Ratifying Convention. But immediately it was noticed, in Virginia especially, and they had quite a few Baptists there, that the document did not contain personal liberties, and that's true. There were no personal liberties defined in the Constitution. They said that we had certain inalienable rights, but those rights weren't listed. And certainly one of those rights would not have been the freedom of worship. And so James Madison of Virginia, he wanted to attend the Virginia Ratifying Convention. He wanted to be part of the ratification of the Constitution already passed in Philadelphia. And that convention was going to be 1788. The problem is, he knew he was unlikely to be elected to the Virginia Ratifying Convention. In fact, people told him, you don't have the votes. And so, because of this established Anglican Church, James Madison, who was part of the original writing of the Constitution, he was in trouble trying to go on from there. And at that time, the Anglican Church in Virginia gave Baptists fines, jailing, forbidden to preach without a license. So Virginia had a suspicion of the federal government based on the Baptists. He needed, though, that Baptist vote. Politics never changes. You got to have that block of votes to be elected to the ratifying convention. He also recognized many Virginia Baptists were reluctant to support the new Constitution because of no protection for religious liberty. And he was concerned then with the rejection in Virginia of the Constitution. If there was a freedom of religion, if there was no freedom of religion clause, because like Massachusetts, I mixed that up a little bit, the rejection of the Constitution is what he was afraid of, because if you'd have tried to put freedom of religion into the original Constitution, Massachusetts would never have signed it. New Hampshire, Connecticut, all of that New England area were not going to sign a constitution that gave religious freedom because they had a state church and they used that church to control their people. It wasn't the fault of the Christians who went to that church, but the government used the church for their purposes, which became a significant problem. So Massachusetts still had a legal tax-supported church. So in Virginia, there was a well-known Baptist preacher, very popular, and he was a strong advocate of religious liberty, like we've seen in earlier individuals. He was concerned there was no listing of individual rights, so he was hesitant to see the Constitution ratified. And he wrote this. He said, there is no Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Whenever a number of men enter into a state or society, a number of individual rights must be given up to that society. And we do that. We obey the laws of a society and so on. He said, but there should be a memorial. There should be a listing of rights that are not surrendered. Otherwise, every natural and domestic right becomes alienable. In other words, it won't exist. And certainly, when the Constitution was written and it was being approved, freedom of religion didn't exist in 9 out of the 13 states. And so what he was concerned about, he says, what is dearest of all, religious liberty is not sufficiently secure. And so he was concerned. I mean, that was true of so many things. Women didn't have the right to vote. Black folks, the slavery folks, they weren't even citizens and so on. Those inalienable rights did not include anybody, and that includes people like ourselves who wanted to worship God the way their conscience directed. So he said government has no more to do with with the religious opinions of men than it has to do with the principles of mathematics. Yeah, the principles of religion has nothing to do with government. He insisted that civil government should not control the church. So James Madison knew he was in trouble. This guy had great influence throughout Virginia. And so Madison decided, based on information he was receiving, I'm not going to make it to the ratifying convention because the votes are against me. So Madison was encouraged by a number of friends to meet with Leland in 1788 before the election. Leland insisted and said the freedom of religion has to be protected first. The government should never establish one denomination over another, and conscience belongs to God, not the civil government. And so Madison then made a promise to Leland. He was not intending to change the Constitution. He knew they couldn't put freedom of religion in the original Constitution because too many of the states would reject it. They wanted their own state church to control their population. So he promised Leland then that if he was elected, he would work to add a Bill of Rights protecting freedom once Congress was formed. Article 5 of the Constitution, as we're aware, provided for adding amendments to the Constitution. Well, Leland then withdrew his opposition to Madison, and he also was thinking about being in the congressional race himself. He was going to go to the ratifying convention if he could be elected instead of Madison, and he would fight the Constitution. At that point, at least he declined to oppose Madison, cleared the way for Madison's election. So the Virginia ratifying convention took place. Madison got the votes he needed to participate in the ratifying convention with Leland's support. Virginia ratified the convention in 1788, but at that point it had already been ratified anyway. New Hampshire beat them by 4 days. So they wanted the ratification for Virginia. It was an important state, a big state. People like Jefferson, Washington, and so on were from there. And so now there was indeed a government with a constitution. And so now the first Congress would meet in Washington. And Madison indeed kept his promise. He presented a Bill of Rights, June 8, 1789, with constitutional amendments as allowed by Article 5 of the Constitution. Madison prepared then a bill based on the fact that he was under pressure if he did not. He said Congress will make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people to assemble and to petition the government for a list of grievances. So at the first Congress then, there was great opposition to these Bill of Rights because of freedom of religion. There was a significant battle that took place, but in 1789, the Bill of Rights was finally passed and then had to be submitted to the colonies once again for ratification. And the 10 amendments then became the United States Bill of Rights when Virginia became the required 11th state. But Massachusetts refused to take action during that period of time. They didn't vote against it, but they didn't vote for it. They neither ratified nor rejected the proposal at that time, and it was indeed the last state to end its legally established tax-supported church in 1833, some 40 years later. But Massachusetts finally did ratify the Bill of Rights, but it wasn't until 1939, 82 years ago, that Massachusetts said, oh, okay, fine, we will ratify the Bill of Rights. It had long since been there, 148 years the Bill of Rights had been in existence. I assume that probably was a big thing in the newspaper, but I was only 2, so I couldn't read it. But anyway, the historians in this history of American Christianity, it's written this way. The active labor in this cause was mainly done by the Baptists, the cause of religious freedom. It is to their consistency and constancy in the warfare against the privileges, and I like that phrase, the privileges of the powerful standing order. At that time, those state governments wanted people to worship only the way they said so they could control the others. And that he called a final triumph in this country, a principle of separation of church and state, one of the largest contributions of the New World to civilization, because up till then it had never happened anywhere since the days of Constantine and even before that. There was one, and I don't even know what the case was all about, but there was one case, went to the Supreme Court because of states' rights and that sort of thing. And the Supreme Court said this in 1947, the establishment of the religion clause of the First Amendment needs at least this: neither a state nor the federal government can set up a church or can pass laws against one religion or religions or prefer one religion to another. In the words of Jefferson, the First Amendment clause against establishment of religion by law. And based on that, I've covered up too much, the wall must be kept high. There's a wall, he said, of separation between church and state, which still looks like this today. The U.S. government and the idea of establishment of a church to control its people has that Article 1 Bill of Rights, which the Baptists very much insisted on. Freedom of speech, press, and assembling also came along with that, which is very similar. But that does not mean that God must be kept out of government activity. And people still today will object to the fact that God is mentioned 4 times in the Constitution. The name of God in the when you before a meeting you say the Pledge of Allegiance. My mind is racing, but they would like to get rid of God there. You see, they say why? Because the First Amendment says you can't have church and government, but you can't eliminate God because of Amendment 1. And that's something that continues to need to be fought today. People would like to remove God completely out of the American thinking. They'd like to have it gone, not just because they're atheists, but because they just are so afraid that the government might get back into the idea of religious suppression. So we can keep God in prayers before civic meetings, cities, councils, all that sort of thing. Prayer can still be there. It has nothing to do with Article 1 of the Bill of Rights. That has to do with the government not being able to establish a church in order to control their people. Well, I'm over time. Let's close with the word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we're thankful that today we can live in a country so unique, with such freedom and right to worship as we see fit. We're thankful, Lord, how you have guided this over the years. We're thankful for those individuals who have stood their ground and insisted that we should have a right to worship as our conscience directs us. We just ask that all of these things might impress in us our need to follow you, to follow your word, to recognize that you indeed are still in control. So we ask it all in Christ's name. Amen. Thank you for your time. Next week we will go ahead when folks come back and get back into the book again.